Anti-vaccination movements are not new. In the 1700s, in the midst of a smallpox epidemic, Bostonians rampaged against those who sought to inoculate the public, assaulted them in the streets, and threw bombs at their houses. In a dumb twist, they even rounded up the inoculated and forcibly quarantined them in an offshore island. The following century in Montreal, in the midst of another smallpox epidemic, antivaxxers rioted, destroyed public health buildings, vandalized pharmacies that sold the smallpox vaccine, trashed the central police station, and stabbed and stoned the police chief. Following are 20 things about those and other dumb moments from the history of medicine. A triumph of humanity threatened by dumb beliefs and science-wise-sounding gibberish. Vaccination is the most effective method to prevent or combat infectious diseases, and the use of vaccines on a global scale in the modern era has been one of humanity's greatest medical triumphs. Vaccination and the resultant widespread immunity have led to the worldwide eradication of the deadly smallpox, a highly infectious contagion that killed about 10% to 30% of those who caught it, and scarred, blinded, or otherwise disfigured most of the rest. Vaccination has also eliminated diseases such as tetanus and polio from much of the world. Numerous studies over the years have verified the effectiveness of vaccination. Nonetheless, an eruption or more like resurgence of dumb beliefs that lack any scientific support threaten to undo much of that progress. For example, measles, a highly infectious disease that killed millions around the world every year, until as recently as the 1980s, saw its fatalities drop to only 73,000 a year because of widespread vaccination. In the United States, measles was all but eradicated until a wave of vaccine resistance, based on science-wise-sounding gibberish and fraudulent studies, fueled a comeback. Unfortunately, as seen below, such irrational resistance has historic precedent. Anti-vaxxers have been around since vaccines were first invented. Variolation: the spread of proto-vaccination. Irrational resistance to inoculation cropped up even before vaccines were invented. The first recorded method to immunize people against an infectious disease, smallpox, was variolation. Named after the illness strains, variola minor and variola major, material was taken from a recently infected person and given to the hail to produce a mild infection. The deliberately variolated individual would develop some small, unlocalized pustules just like those caused by smallpox. After about a month, they would subside, and whatever mild disease symptoms had cropped up would fade away. That would leave the recipient immune from future and decidedly more dangerous bouts of illness. The risk of death was around 0.5% to 2%, but it was still far better than the risk of a naturally occurring smallpox infection. First used in China in the 15th century, the method spread to India, the Middle East and Africa, and eventually reached Britain and North America in the 18th century. Testing was crude and by modern standards controversial. In 1722, 6 condemned inmates at Newgate Prison were offered their freedom if they agreed to get variolated, and then exposed to smallpox. The test was a success, and variolation spread, but not without vehement resistance from some segments of the public. America's first dumb anti-vaxxer movement. The demonstrable success of variolation in controlling the spread of smallpox did not prevent resistance to the method from taking root among some of the public's more reactionary segments. In 1721, for example, a smallpox outbreak infected more than half of Boston's population of 10,600 and killed 844 people. In the American colony's first experiment with public inoculation, Puritan minister Cotton Mather partnered up with Harvard physician Zobdiel Boylston to immunize hundreds of Bostonians. The reaction birthed America's first dumb anti-vaccination movement. Many outraged New Englanders poured calumny upon the inoculation effort. The New England Courant, one of America's first newspapers, published sensationalist articles against the endeavor. As one of them put it, some have been carrying about instruments of inoculation and bottles of poisonous humor to infect all who are willing to submit to it. Can any man infect a family in the morning and pray to God in the evening that the distemper will not spread? As seen below, it was the start of a nasty, even compared to modern standards, anti-vaxxer campaign. In a dumb twist, America's first anti-vaxxers forced the vaccinated to quarantine. Of those variolated by Zobdiel Boylston, 2% died. That was far better than the 15% death rate of Bostonians who had naturally contracted the disease. Nonetheless, Boston's City Council condemned inoculation, and Dr. Boylston was assaulted on the streets and forced to go into hiding. Cotton Mather had a crude bomb thrown into his house. Fortunately, it was so crude and constructed in what turned out to be such an ineptly dumb fashion that it failed to explode. Tied to it was a note that read, "Cotton Mather, I was once of your meeting, but the cursed lie you told of you know who made me leave you. You dog, and damn you, I will inoculate you with this, with a pox on you. Much of the opposition was driven by religion. For example, a prominent Boston clergyman declared that inoculation was sinful, because it was not in the rules of natural physics. In what comes across as a bizarre twist to modern sensibilities, angry and violent Bostonian anti-vaxxer mobs even forced the inoculated into quarantine on Spectacle Island, 4 miles offshore in Boston Harbor. The New England Courant pumped out a steady stream of satirical anti-vaxxer articles. Its editor was Benjamin Franklin. The future polymath scientist and founding father was 16 years old at the time, and like many teenagers, he did not miss the opportunity to troll. Development of a safer smallpox vaccine from cowpox. Variolation did wonders to stave off smallpox, but only among the variolated, a minority of the population. Voltaire estimated that in his day, about 60% of the population came down with smallpox. Of those, about 20% died, and many of those who survived were left blind or with disfiguring pockmarks. The fight against smallpox took a major leap in 1796, when British Dr. Edward Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine. Unlike variolation, which used smallpox material for inoculation, Jenner used the mild cowpox virus, which infects cattle. Inoculation with cowpox conferred immunity against the deadlier and more dangerous smallpox. Jenner tested his theory on his gardener's son, whom he inoculated with cowpox, then deliberately gave him a dose of smallpox, which did not take. Further tests on 23 more patients, including Jenner's own 11-month-old son, confirmed the effectiveness of cowpox to inoculate against smallpox. Death rates from inoculation via smallpox variolation took a nosedive from a typical 0.5 to 2% to virtually none when cowpox vaccination was used. Widespread vaccination with Jenner's methods began in the early 1800s, and as seen below were met with vehement and often dumb criticism from the era's anti-vaxxers. Dumb anti-vaxxer takes from the 1800s. Opposition to Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine was fierce from some segments of the public. Their rationales varied, and included religious, sanitary, political, and science-wise sounding gibberish objections. Some, including many of the clergy, thought that vaccination with the cowpox was unchristian, because it came from an animal. Some had a general distrust of medicine, and rejected Jenner's ideas about how the disease spread. Rather than infection from person to person, they thought that smallpox was caused by decayed matter in the atmosphere. Some parents were afraid of the process of vaccination in of itself. Syringes with needles had not been invented yet, and inoculation was performed via a cut in a child's arm, into which lymph from a person who had been vaccinated about a week earlier was inserted. Others objected to vaccination on grounds that violated their personal liberty. The latter objections grew in vehemence when governments tired of explaining the public benefit of mass vaccination to those too dumb to or too determined not to get it, and developed mandatory vaccine policies. The 19th century anti-vaxxer movement. Eventually, the British Parliament legislated the Vaccination Act of 1853, which mandated the vaccination of all infants within 3 months of their birth, or 4 months if they were in an orphanage. Notice of the requirement was to be given to parents or guardians when a birth was registered, and certificates of vaccination were to be returned by doctors to the registrar of birth. In 1867, the age requirement was extended to 14, and penalties were added for parents who failed to vaccinate their children. Immediate resistance erupted from many, who objected to the shift from voluntary vaccination to mandatory, and they demanded the right to control their bodies and those of their children. The Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League and the National Anti-Vaccination League were formed. British anti-vaxxers took their act on the road and went international. A visit across the pond to the United States, by British vaccination opponent William Tebb, triggered the foundation in 1879, of the Anti-Vaccination Society of America to oppose compulsory smallpox vaccination. The 1885 Montreal smallpox epidemic. Ever since inoculation was developed, there has never been a shortage of a vocal, and often irrational minority to vehemently protest and rile up the community against efforts to combat the spread of infectious diseases. With the spread of education and public knowledge of vaccination, such antivaxxers usually lose, but not before they have caused significant damage, though sometimes they outright won and the results tend to be catastrophic. One such anti-vaxxer win occurred in Montreal, in 1885. It began that March, when a train conductor infected with smallpox took to bed in a local hotel. He recovered, but a laundrymaid caught the disease from his linens. She died on April 2nd, but not before she had passed it on to her sister, who also died. By late summer, the smallpox had spread all over Montreal and surrounding areas. When the contagion came to an end, the region had experienced an epidemic with shockingly high fatality rates of around 40%. More than 6,000 died and 13,000 were disfigured, most of them children. The overwhelming majority of them would not have gotten sick in the first place, if not for the success of a dumb and irrational anti-vaccination campaign. An unscrupulous anti-vaccination campaign that targeted the poor and poorly educated. By the time smallpox arrived in Montreal in the spring of 1885, Edward Jenner's vaccine was nearly a century old, and its effectiveness was well known. Nonetheless, Montreal suffered an epidemic that killed off 40% of those who came down with an easily preventable disease. The reason was a successful anti-vaccination campaign that raised dumb objections to and stoked unfounded fears about the inoculation. The fear-mongering was most effective in Montreal's east side, inhabited mostly by poor and less educated French Canadians. Those unfortunates, misguided by unscrupulous and irrational anti-vaxxers, ended up making 9/10 of those killed by the contagion. Vaccine opponents made it their mission to whip up worries about the smallpox vaccine. One of the more prominent of their numbers was a Dr. Alexander M. Ross, who edited a publication called The Anti-Vaccinator. He falsely claimed that vaccination is useless and dangerous, and that the vaccine was a fearful engine of destruction and death to children. His efforts eventually whipped up dumb riots against the smallpox vaccine. The roots of anti-vaxxer conspiracies. Most of us are small fish in a very large pond, but the egos of some refuse to accept that then as now many 19th century anti-vaxxers were driven not by reason and logic, but by an emotional need to become big fish. As such, no facts or reasoning could get them to alter a position that they had not reached based on facts or reason. They figured that they had discovered a nearly effortless shortcut, reading a few pamphlets then, that gave them superior insider knowledge. The possession of such knowledge made them feel smarter than genuinely smart people, the experts who had put in years of hard work and study to understand complex things. In the weird world of dumb conspiracies, be they anti-vaxxer, flat earth, September 11th, trutherism, QAnon, the believers are suddenly smart according to those who believe as they do, although without any significant accomplishments or merit. Belief in the conspiracy makes them enlightened, and allows them to lord it over everybody else. Without significant effort or serious study, they can still act like and be accepted as experts within their niche group, and validate each other's need to be acknowledged as smart. That instantly transforms them into big fish in a small pond, and nothing will get them to leave that pond. The 1885 Montreal anti-vaxxers, like they're up today, were not so much proselytizing their anti-vaccine conspiracy as they were defending their own egos. An unscrupulous 19th century anti-vaxxer. As the smallpox raced through Montreal in 1885, anti-vaxxers such as the quack Dr. Alexander M. Ross led a campaign that urged refusal of the vaccine. His publication, The Anti-Vaccinator, derided the vaccinated as being driven like dumb animals, and falsely stated that vaccination does not prevent smallpox in any case. That was bad, but what was even worse was that Ross had quietly vaccinated himself at the start of the epidemic. He nonetheless urged others not to get vaccinated, and led an antivaxxer campaign because it gave him an opportunity to pose as a hero. Although over 100 years separate us from Dr. Ross, his methods in the 19th century were remarkably similar to those used by anti-vaxxers in the 21st. Like his modern equivalents, Ross pooh-poohed the alarm of public health officials as senseless panic, and decried a perceived violation of personal liberty. He also peddled conspiracies about the greed of the medical establishment, exaggerated the risk of vaccines, and cherry-picked evidence from a minority of like-minded quack doctors who opposed vaccines. He and other anti-vaxxers also made up sensationalist lies, such as vaccine administrators invading women's bedrooms, with the women always dramatically in states of undress, to tie them and their children down and forcibly vaccinate them. As seen below, his efforts triggered a violent anti-vaxxer riot. The Montreal anti-vaxxer riot of 1885. By September 2, 1885, Montreal's Board of Health believed that there were 2,000 smallpox cases in the city, and within a few weeks, the numbers had doubled to more than 4,000. That was when the authorities began to take sterner measures to combat the illness. They included the forcible removal of people from housing conditions, mostly in poor neighborhoods, such as predominantly French Canadian ones in the city's east side, that made isolation impossible. On September 28, vaccination was made mandatory. The response was a howling mob, primed for weeks and whipped into a frenzy by publications such as Dr. Ross the Anti-Vaccinator. They surrounded the Board of Health's East End branch office and destroyed it. Police were called in, but they were routed and chased away by the mob. The anti-vaxxers then rampaged through the city, smashed the windows of pharmacies that sold the smallpox vaccine, and vandalized the homes of health officials. The central police station's windows were all broken, and the chief of police was stabbed and pelted with stones. Rioters fired at police, who armed themselves with rifles and bayonets, and fired above the antivaxxers' heads. The cops finally clubbed the mob until it dispersed into small groups that continued the violent assaults and destruction of property around Montreal. The following day, 1,400 soldiers were called in to patrol the city and prevent a recurrence, and health workers were issued revolvers. The U.S. Supreme upheld the power of the government to mandate vaccination for infectious diseases. To Canada South, smallpox outbreaks in late 19th century America led to more widespread vaccination campaigns. Those in turn brought all the dumb anti-vaxxer objections out of the woodworks. The 1879 founding of the Anti-Vaccination Society of America was followed by organizations such as the New England Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League, founded in 1882, and the Anti-Vaccination League of New York City in 1885. American anti-vaxxers sued to repeal vaccination laws in several states, including Illinois, Wisconsin, and California, but lost. The most prominent of those cases began in 1902 after a smallpox outbreak in Cambridge, Massachusetts, when the Board of Health mandated the vaccination of all residents against smallpox. A Henning Jacobson refused to get vaccinated on grounds that he should be able to do as he pleased with his own body. He was criminally charged, convicted, and appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Jacobson, Massachusetts, 197 U.S. 11, 1905, the Supreme Court upheld the authority of states to enforce compulsory vaccination laws to protect the public from infectious diseases. It also ruled that individual liberty is not absolute, but must give way to the state's police power. Subsequent decisions reaffirmed Jacobson and the primacy of the state's power over individual rights when it comes to public health, such as Zoot King in 1922, which held that schools could deny admission to students who failed to receive required vaccinations. The dumb roots of the modern anti-vaccination movement. British anti-vaxxers played a key role in the spread of opposition to vaccination in America. In the 19th century, British anti-vaxxer William Tebb played a key role in founding the Anti-Vaccination Society of America. In the late 20th century, another British anti-vaxxer fueled yet another vaccination opposition movement across the pond. He was Andrew Wakefield, a doctor who published a relatively obscure study in The Lancet, a prestigious medical journal. In it he alleged that he had discovered a link between the combined measles, mumps, and rubella (MMR) vaccine and autism. Wakefield's claims were widely reported and led to a drop in vaccination rates in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and eventually the U.S. As a result, many children died or suffered serious permanent injuries. It was bad. What was even worse is that the study published in The Lancet was fraudulent. Not as in controversial or poorly researched or mistaken, but as in straightforward deliberately fraudulent. As in the serious and deliberate type of criminal fraud, for which fraudsters lose the license to practice their profession. Nonetheless, that fraud gave birth to a dumb movement that has killed or seriously injured many, and threatens to kill or seriously harm many millions more. The fraudulent roots of a study. The publication of Dr. Wakefield's study generated significant interest and controversy, so other large-scale studies were conducted to follow through and shed more light on his claims. However, researchers were unable to find any evidence to support his findings or replicate his work. So attention then shifted to the examination of Dr. Wakefield's methodology. Just how did the British physician arrive at his conclusions that linked the MMR vaccine to autism? It turned out that he had simply fabricated the evidence. Wakefield did not make mistakes in his research. He simply made up much of the research and invented it out of thin air. To ice the cake, and transform the British physician from a dumb and incompetent researcher or crank into a cartoonish villain, it was discovered that Wakefield had been paid 55,000 British pounds to claim that MMR vaccines caused autism. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. It was later discovered that Wakefield stood to make tens of millions of US dollars per year from his fraudulent study. Andrew Wakefield's fraud cost him his medical license. Among the many things that drive, Wakefield had not mentioned, when he submitted his study to The Lancet, was not just how much he was paid to make those claims, but how much he stood to make down the road from his fraud. The British physician stood to make up to $43 million per year from selling test kits, linked to his bogus study and the supposed connection between vaccines and autism. On top of that, several of the parents used in his study were litigants engaged in lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies. Naturally, Wakefield had failed to disclose any of those conflicts. With the egg on the Lancet's face, its editor-in-chief wrote, "It seems obvious now that had we appreciated the full context, in which the work reported in the 1998 Lancet paper by Wakefield and colleagues was done, publication would not have taken place." After the vaccine study was revealed as a fraud, it was retracted by the Lancet. As to Dr. Wakefield, he was found guilty by British medical authorities of serious professional misconduct and fraud, and had his medical license revoked. The dire consequences of a dumb movement based on a fraudulent study. Unfortunately, because a lie travels halfway around the world, while the truth is still tying its bootlaces, by the time Wakefield's fraud was uncovered, his bogus findings had found resonance within certain population segments. It went on to seed a dumb movement and became fervent anti-vaccination activists. Despite the fact that the study upon which their activism is based has been debunked as a fraud, those activists convinced many of the poorly informed, poorly educated or gullible that vaccines are bad for children. Thus, one of the greatest medical advances in human history, which helped end widespread epidemics that killed a majority of children before they reached adulthood, is threatened. Childhood diseases that had been all but eliminated are making a comeback, and a steadily growing number of unvaccinated children are dying or suffering grave illnesses that leave them crippled for life. As such, this fraud has been described as the most damaging hoax of the past century, a fraud that has already killed or maimed many children, and has the potential to kill or maim millions more. The dumb belief in the healing properties of tobacco. The irrational resistance to vaccines is in good or bad, depending on how you look at it. When it comes to dumb beliefs about medicine, another one revolves around the beliefs about the supposed benefits of tobacco smoke. In the 21st century, the harmful effects of tobacco are well known and understood in most of the world. However, there was a time in history when not only were tobacco's ills unknown, but tobacco was actually considered healthy and good for you. First introduced to Europe by the Spanish, circa 1528, tobacco was lauded as a cure for many ailments, not only by quacks and charlatans, but also by respected members of the mainstream medical establishment. From early on, it was described as a sacred herb because of its supposed medicinal properties, as claimed by various Native Americans. Before long, European medical practitioners had taken to prescribing the newly introduced plant as a miracle cure for sundry ailments, from headaches and colds to cancer. When blowing smoke up the rear was a literal thing. Today, when somebody scoffs at another that "you're just blowing smoke up my ass," it is meant as a figure of speech to mean that the addressee is guilty of insincerely complimenting the scoffer and is telling him what he thinks he wants to hear. However, centuries ago, blowing smoke up the ass was meant literally to describe a medical procedure in which a tube or rubber hose was inserted up a person's rectum, through which tobacco smoke was then blown. In the 1700s, doctors routinely used tobacco smoke enemas in the mistaken belief that they had healing properties, especially since tobacco was seen as a beneficial plant and a near-miraculous cure for all kinds of ailments. Blowing smoke up the ass was thought to be particularly useful in reviving drowning victims. The nicotine in the tobacco was thought to make the heart beat faster, and thus stimulated respiration, while the smoke from the burning tobacco leaves was thought to warm the drowned individual from the inside. The intuitive sense of blowing smoke up drowned people's asses. In the context of the time and in light of prevailing medical wisdom, tobacco smoke enemas did not sound as dumb to people in the 1700s as they seem to us today. The treatment made intuitive sense. The drowned person was full of water, so blowing air, in the form of tobacco smoke, would expel the water, and the fact that such air was from a plant with healing properties, as tobacco was believed to possess, was an added benefit. The hiccup, of course, was that the water was in the drowned person's lungs, which are not connected to his or her rear end. Because of that overlooked bit of human biology, the act of blowing air up the rear ends of drowning victims and into their bowels did little to expel water from their lungs. Although some doctors preferred to stick the tube directly into the lungs through the mouth or nose, most preferred to shove it up the patient's butt instead. Although medically useless, belief in the efficacy of tobacco smoke enemas in reviving drowning victims, or even those presumed dead, was widespread.